Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. My name is Arlene Sachs. This is Sally Ann Sachs. And today we'd like to welcome Paul. Paul Shapiro is the director of the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum.
Got that all out.
Yeah.
He is also the man who single-handedly is responsible for the opening of the largest archive of the Holocaust era and the last secret closed archive of that era. So, Paul, tell us about this. It's the International Tracing Service in Bad Arolsen, Germany.
Right.
Will you tell us what's there? What's
Look,
it all about?
Thanks, Sally Ann. This is really a massive collection of material that deals with the fates of 17.5 million victims of National Socialism. The amount of documentation there is quite hard to imagine. It's over 50 million pages of material.
50 million.
And this is material that, in part, was picked up by liberating forces at the end of World War II as they liberated concentration camps, as they liberated slave labor sites. They collected the documentation that was there and they placed it in one repository in order to use it at the end of the war to see if they could return people to their homes, to see if they could reunite families. And so that piece of it is a massive piece. And then there's also the collection of records from the displaced persons camps that were operated in 7 different zones, 3 occupation zones in Germany, occupation zones in Austria, also camps that were in Italy and Switzerland and some other places. Those records that also deal with the fates, the resettlement, the histories, and the treatment of displaced persons after the war. Maybe the easiest way for me to describe the material is to show you a little graphic of what the categories of material consist of. And if we can show those graphics, maybe that's the best way to begin.
The
first slide,
okay,
please.
Just start talking about it. Yes.
So I like to describe this as 4 plus 1. Here's a general schematic, but if we go to the next slide, and we'll look at this in pieces so that it's more visible. The first category of documentation that's there, and this is actually documentation that we already have at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, recently transferred from Bad Arolsen. They call the incarceration documents. Essentially what is there is almost 18 million pages of material from concentration camps, their deportation lists, transport lists, camp records, Gestapo arrest records of people who were sent to camps, and also prison records. And you can see from that schematic that there are lists of major camps, and then under those there are, you can't see it here, but there are hundreds of sub-camps and sites that were dependent, as well as those other sources of material. The second big category of material, if we can go to the next slide, is material that relates to forced labor. This is roughly 8.5 million pages of material of forced and slave labor. We know at this point, sadly, all of Europe was a slave labor site, essentially, in every town, in every location where the perpetrators of the Holocaust needed labor, they were using forced labor, and everyone was using labor. The government, the military, local industry, local firms, local churches, everyone was using it because it was cheap. And this is really a record of what happens when human beings are treated as assets to be used up, not as human beings. The third category, maybe we can take a quick look at that. Well, actually, we've skipped one. If we go back to the prior slide, you'll see there's a category of post-war documents, and these are the documents of the displaced persons camps and of emigration. 15 million pages is a rough estimate, including a card file of over 3 million original displaced person camp cards. Then there's also, and maybe we don't have to look at each one, there's also a central name index that records.
How many names?
17.5 million names, recognize that they've only archived the names of people who were victims. There are many more names in this archive, including names of perpetrators, including names of people who, after the war, helped resettle displaced persons. And then finally, there's a smaller collection that they call a historical collection, which includes a variety of other kinds of documentation.
Isn't there also the one that you and I have talked about, the so-called TD collection?
Right.
This interests me very much. So can we tell about that one?
Sure. So it's a great question. At the time that we were working to open this archive, there was limited information available about what was in many of the collections. Once it was possible to enter the buildings and see the material, we discovered also that there was a huge set, about 2.5 million files, of inquiry files. In other words, people who had written in asking questions. Can you find this relative? Can you tell us more about this person that we know?
That really interests me.
That's the one, for family historians, that's the one. Can you find my mother, father, sister, brother?
And in the process of asking the questions, the people who were alive and who were asking the questions were also providing huge amounts of information about their own experiences and about their families. So very late in the process, that material was also added to the material to be open for research.
That's what fascinates me. I want to go there. Now, how come it's taken so many years, 45, 50 years?
60.
60 years, I mean, to look at this.
That's a story.
It's a long story, but there are a few factors involved. First, the administrative and supervisory setup relating to the International Tracing Service was very complicated. There's a governing board of 11 governments. The collection is actually administered under the auspices of the International Committee of the Red Cross. The German government, under post-war treaty obligation, funds the operation, and there was local leadership of the operation. And in order to get anything done, one had to achieve consensus among all of those players.
Yeah. Consensus means unanimity?
Consensus means everyone had to agree. So this was one factor, a very complex governing structure. There was also limited material available, limited information available to most of the players. If you ask most of the governments on that board, what are the materials in this tracing service, they wouldn't be able to tell you. The board met once a year, and that was supposed to make rules. And if nothing happened, well, nothing happened for another year. Finally, I would say, and this maybe is the most tragic part, even though survivors of the Holocaust and survivor organizations asked repeatedly for the material to be open for research and more open to survivors so they could actually see the material, the governments were not very responsive. And I think there's a statement there, there's a kind of warning there that relates not just to this collection, but in general. It's easy for governments and easy for big organizations to not take seriously the concerns of people who are perceived to have no power. And Holocaust survivors are perceived that way, and survivors of genocide are perceived that way. Well, God knows, unfortunately, we're still living in a genocide era, and there's a warning here about the ability of governments, even good governments, and these are all governments that have done tremendously good deeds over the years and have worked hard on Holocaust issues. It's just possible for them not to pay attention.
Do you think they just want to forget it and go on?
I don't think this was high on anyone's radar screen.
Yeah.
I think each one of the governments and the Red Cross had reasons for not making an issue of this. Fortunately, we had the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum where it's our business to make this kind of issue a central issue.
We've heard in the last few years, since some of this has become a little bit more open and available through means, that people are still finding sisters and brothers and very close relatives that each thought they were dead.
That's
as this material.
I have to, Paul won't say this about it, but when he first came to the museum, I thought I was going to open ITS in my hubris. And I met with Paul, and he was very tactful and kind, and he basically said, leave it to me, I'll take care of it. And he has. And what he hasn't said is that it took a campaign on his part, really, to a well thought out campaign. So now, you've succeeded almost. I mean, it's still not totally agreed to open this. There's still a couple countries that have to.
Actually,
let's say what we mean by opening. You're not getting the actual documents. You're getting a microfilm of the documents.
In fact, this definition of opening is very important. For anyone who's been to Bad Arolsen, you know that it is a schlep to get there. It's not a big town, it's a tiny town.
Fly to Frankfurt, take us 2 trains.
It's quite isolated. And to open materials in an isolated spot where there's really not a research facility, to us didn't mean opening. So part of the campaign that we led was not only to have the material open to researchers, but to make copies of the material available in major research centers that focus on the Holocaust around the world. And through the campaign, as Sally Ann has said, that we led, that was the final agreement. So the material is all being digitized in color so that you don't lose the effect of color coding and so on. It's all being digitized, and a complete set of the documentation will be deposited at U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, Yad Vashem in Israel, the Institute for National Remembrance in Poland. It seems also at the Center for Contemporary Jewish Documentation in Paris. Each of the countries on the governing board has the right to ask for a copy and place it in a research institution. And that really will make it accessible.
Well, up to a point, because you said there's 50 billion pieces of paper or microfilm sheets. How are we going to look at those? Or am I getting ahead of myself?
Well, you're moving right through the process in a very logical way, and I'm glad that you are.
Okay.
What we are receiving and what the other organizations are receiving are digital images of the documents, because no one ever expected this material actually to be accessible for research, because it was never utilized for any purpose other than finding an individual's name in all of those 60 years. The documentation is not coming organized the way one normally sees archival material. So literally, we are getting 50 million, the images of 50 million documents, plus the images of 50 million name cards in that central name index that I described. And the challenge that we face is organizing that material so that people can actually find what they are looking for in it. We're doing that in 3 steps. And I'm delighted to say that there's just huge interest at our museum in pursuing this in an urgent manner. It's easy for us to sit here and talk about this somewhat dispassionately, but if you're a survivor or if you're family of survivor, you want to know now what information is there. Now, we have been able to organize a list of over 21,000 collections of material that were placed in Bad Arolsen, both at the end of the war and in the 60 years between the end of the war to now, because governments continue to place materials there, maybe thinking that they wouldn't be accessible for research, and others continue to place material there. That list of collections we've organized as a search tool, and we'll be placing on the museum's website and simultaneously on the ITS website in a matter of a week or 2 weeks.
Wonderful.
Now, what you can see there are whether there are collections of material that relate to the issue that's of concern to you. You can't see the documents. But at least one of the aspects of this collection that made it secret, Sally Ann used the word secret, was that there was no public information about what was there. So people had no idea whether there was information there that could answer their questions or not. So just getting information about the collections out is an important first step.
Before you don't even know what to ask, or you can't even imagine that they would have had.
Right.
And then the second level, help me find out whether the name of someone that I lost, or the name of someone that I loved, or my name is there. Now that's a challenge, and yet ITS has done quite a good job of pulling out of this documentation that central name index that I've referred to. And there are the names of 17.5 million victims who, in one way or another, figure in this documentation.
Plus the inquirers' names are there too, I believe, in the central index.
In some cases.
Okay.
Well, it would seem to me that a name index, if you just took the names, that would be relatively easy to index.
Unfortunately, the name index is not databased. So we are getting 50 million cards with all kinds of information on it, but you can't Google those cards. And we made a calculation, I think it's the right one, that the amount of time that would be required to make that directly searchable, well, would take several years. We don't want people to wait another several years. They've waited 60 years already to have this information. So we've trained a team of people at the museum to use a kind of search tool in the name index to at least be able to inform people, is there documentation there about the person I'm interested in or not? And once the material can be made public, we'll make an announcement about the ability of people to inquire.
That's the next question. When? What do you mean when it's going to be made public?
Look,
or once it can be made public?
Part of the political process was this search for consensus, for agreement among the governments. And several of the governments, not all of them, but several of them insisted that until every government had agreed, the material couldn't be made public. And since the announcement that the material would be made public, which was already 18 months ago, we've worked very hard in ways that I can't describe to you today and probably wouldn't describe in public, worked very hard to have those governments ratify the necessary papers to make the material public. I'm happy to say today that the last two countries that had to agree to do that, and they had to do it through their parliaments, have done that, have taken that action. One just last Tuesday evening. So we now have parliamentary ratification by all of the governments. There's still a short process through which they have to notify the holder of the original treaty, which is Germany, that they've ratified, and then a signature by the International Committee of the Red Cross to implement these agreements. But we're very, very close to the end of that process. And that means that in a formal sense, the material will be open, which pulls you right back to the question, how do people find what they're looking for?
So if you want to know whether there's anything on your great aunt, do you write to the Holocaust Museum?
We'll make it possible to do it in a number of ways. By writing to the museum, we've developed an online questionnaire so that people who use the internet will be able to ask directly and get a response that way, because that's so much faster than anything else. And frankly, if we have the documents that refer to that person, and we are getting this documentation in stages in digital form, if we have the documents in digital form, we'll send people back over the internet a copy of an image of the document.
How many people do you have to have working just to answer people's queries?
There are a lot of people at the museum that we've reassigned to do this work. Wonderful. We've benefited from quite a large volunteer corps of people. People do understand that 60 years after the Holocaust, it's time for people to get these answers. We understand it, and so we're putting a lot of effort into it.
You just said something important. Are you still looking for volunteers, or do you have all that you can use right now?
We're still looking for volunteers.
And do you need volunteers with special language skills?
German is especially helpful because a lot of the documentation is in German. The documentation created by the Nazis is in German. There's also lots of displaced persons documentation that's in English, French, other languages, and of course the survivor statements themselves, which are overwhelming in a way. The survivor statements themselves are in every European language.
Yeah. If somebody comes down to the museum, can they do this research themselves rather than having to have a volunteer doing them?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So they have access to those.
Once the material is open, from our perspective, it's open. And the only challenge is getting people to what they are looking for. And because of the nature of the copies that we're getting and the challenge of organizing it to be searchable, our estimate at this point is that people will need help doing that. But if someone wants to come and delve into it themselves, they're more than welcome.
It sounds as if it would be better to do the research in Washington than even in Harrelson, because you're really training a group of people to help make this material usable. Because what you're saying basically is on your own it's probably overwhelming to do it yourself.
On your own at this point in time, it would be overwhelming. I don't want to underappreciate the people who are working at ITS in Bad Arolsen. It's just difficult to get there.
Now, at places like Yad Vashem going to have all the you're sharing the programs, I assume, that you're developing?
Anything that we develop, it's our intention to make available to any holder of this documentation.
Are they working on, like, if you're working on part A, are they working on part B, so you're not duplicating each other?
Look, the museum has played the lead role in this from the beginning. It's our interest for all of the recipient organizations and ITS to work together to get the material into the hands of people interested in having it as quickly as possible. We've invited representatives from all of the recipient organizations that have been identified so far. So that's the Polish Institute of National Memory, CDJC in Paris, Yad Vashem, and ITS, to come to the museum. We'll have this meeting in the middle of November precisely to achieve as much coordination as possible. And that's short term, but also long term. There are parts of this collection that will require cataloging. There are no catalogs to this material. Well, it wouldn't make sense for all the organizations to catalog the same collection. So we're working on the coordination issue.
Before we run out of time, I have a couple of questions. First of all, how do you evaluate the importance of this material?
There are multiple levels, Sally Ann. If you think about it in memorial terms, you can't underestimate the power of knowing the fates of 17.5 million people. If you think about it in moral terms, to me it was immoral for this documentation not to be easily accessible to people with an interest in it, so we're performing a moral function. From a historian's point of view, and I'm a trained historian, 50 million pages of material on the defining event of the 20th century couldn't be more important than that. We live in an era of Holocaust denial. The original documentation is the strongest answer after the survivors themselves. The original documentation is the strongest answer to survival,
You said
to denial.
let's take a look. You had a couple of examples of the kind of materials
Of
that...
a person.
Sure.
Just taking one person as an example.
You may have seen a number of months ago, 60 Minutes did a program on this archive. And I just brought a couple of documents about one of those people. You may remember Nicholas Schwartz. This card is his registration card at Buchenwald. You can actually learn a lot from the card. You see where he was born, what street he lived on. He's defined as a Jew. You see his mother's name. This is the only document in which his mother's name appears, because the two of them were taken from their town, put in a ghetto in Beregovo, a couple of weeks later taken to Auschwitz. His mother was killed at Auschwitz.
And her maiden name is there too.
Right.
As a genealogist, you notice this. Yes.
You see that this boy, because he was only 13 at the time, in the course of less than 6 weeks, was taken from his home, put into a ghetto, sent to Auschwitz, transported to Buchenwald. And you see he has to testify to the facts. You see his signature on this page that we're looking at now. Now, frankly, for many survivors, to see the signature of a father or a mother may be the only thing that they have that's from when that person was alive. So the power of a signature is very, very great. Then if you go to the next document, you see a list. Maybe it's not so legible, but this boy's name, Nicholas Schwartz, is crossed off the list. The list is a list of Hungarian children being sent to the camp at Dora to do wiring of Hitler's super weapons. He's crossed off the list, and you wonder why. It was an issue left hanging in the 60 Minutes piece. The next document tells you why. The day before that transport from Buchenwald to Dora, he was taken to the infirmary because he had developed a throat infection on the transport from Auschwitz to Buchenwald. They didn't want to send a sick boy with other children, and yet they wanted to save him because they needed his labor. And you can see in about 25 documents that relate to this one boy how he survived, what the threats to him were, because being sent to Dora was a death sentence, and how he survived. And at the tail end, you see the document through which the Allied authorities liberated him from Buchenwald, which is where he was at the end of the war. You can actually see on the document, people say that survivors lived their experience after the Holocaust. His liberation on his liberation document,
hurry up, we only have 30 seconds.
He's identified by his Nazi-assigned prisoner number. So that stayed with him even after liberation.
Well, he probably would have had the number tattooed
He did
on.
not have, because he was not registered for work at Auschwitz. But there are cards in which you see noted that person has a tattoo.
This is overwhelming to me.
And we could go on for another couple of hours on this.
Thank you so very much for coming.
And for what you've done. Most of all, for what you've done.
For what you've been able to accomplish.
Thank you very much for the interest. We look forward to making the material available to everyone.
Thank you.
And welcome you to the museum to use it.
Thank you. Just sit here for a few minutes.